I'm here with a special episode of Fun with Maps with a longtime friend, Ash Nallawalla. And through the magic of technology and Zoom, we're able to talk here. Ash, it's 8 o'clock Friday night here in Cleveland, Ohio, in the United States. What's going on and where you are and when is it?
It's 10 a.m. here in Melbourne, Australia.
Isn't that something? We're able to talk here. That's, so as we've discussed, one of the reasons we do Fun with Maps is people just don't know about the world, and the world is smaller, and we should. When you know about the world, you know about the people and all. So, for example, I think if I went out and asked 1,000 random Americans how many states there were in Australia, maybe 10 would know that or something, if that, yeah. Because it's just something we don't study and all. But, and of course, there's 6 states, right?
Yes.
5 on the mainland, and then the one that's the subject of this episode of Fun with Maps, which is Tasmania. So the first thing I want to ask you, I've heard it called Taz and Tassie and all. Are those appropriate? Are those words we can use? Or
yeah, you can call it Tassie, which is what most people use as an affectionate name for the island.
Okay.
No one seems to call it Taz because that's simply a state abbreviation. We have 2-letter and 3-letter abbreviations in Australia. So Victoria is Vic, whereas WA is just WA. It looks like your Washington State abbreviation, but in Australia it stands for Western Australia, and so on. One little factoid about Tasmania is, what do you call the people of Tasmania? And you'll get 2 versions. The most common one is Tasmanian.
Okay.
And it's a logical one. However, you will occasionally hear the word Taswegian.
Really? Taswegian?
Yeah. Just like Glasgow and Glaswegian is what, and I guess that's where the derivation came from.
Oh, that's cool.
And the significance of that is a Taswegian is one who was born in Tasmania.
Okay.
And they take special pride in saying, we are Taswegians.
So they're natives.
Natives, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's the kind of thing you wouldn't know without talking to someone who's so close away. Let me see if I can pull up something here. How's that?
Yeah, that's fine. I can see all of this.
So you're down here in Melbourne.
I'm in Melbourne, yeah. Little, perhaps halfway between Melbourne and Geelong. So Geelong is like our little second largest city in the state. And I'm kind of halfway between those two in a place called Werribee.
Werribee. Okay. So I think when you look at this map, the first thing you notice is, the shape of Tasmania. It looks like a shield, a face.
It looks like an apple. It looks like an apple, and it's called the Apple Isle.
Okay.
Yeah. It's another the Apple Isle.
The other thing you notice right away is that it sure looks likely that over time, X number of years ago, that this was connected to the mainland, right?
Absolutely. Just as New Zealand was connected to the east coast of Australia, if you were to zoom out, you would notice that the shape of New Zealand kind of hugs the coast of Australia if you were to join them together.
Let's see.
So when these continental drifts started separating bits of, I guess, Gondwana land in different directions, and Pangaea before that. So all these started drifting away, and often you will see that these are all jigsaw pieces that are drifting away. And now they seem to be drifting in the other direction. So Australia is getting closer to New Guinea, and by a good inch or 2 every year. So it's like, watch the space. Yeah, watch the space. It may take a few centuries, but they'll be reunified one day.
So we've got this vast strait here that probably formed from ice melting or something way back when. So this is pretty close. You visited Tasmania, right?
Yeah. So Tasmania was obviously attached or very close because there were humans in Tasmania, and unfortunately, the native population was completely wiped out in that state, or back then, before it was a state, as some people might know. The 6 states of Australia were actually separate, independent colonies of the United Kingdom. And Tasmania used to be known as Van Diemen's Land. So, but in those early days of settlers, the native population was completely wiped out. So that's one reason why humans managed to get there. And I guess there must have been a land bridge, because the natives were not known to be sailors. I have not read about any evidence of them even making boats of any kinds, or canoes or anything like that. So I'm guessing that humans were able to cross and populate that stretch of land.
So you're pretty close here, but when you traveled there, did you take a ship? Did you fly? How did you get there?
So I flew direct to Hobart, but my wife has explored the state a little better than I have. So she's flown to Launceston, which is towards the north, and that's a good place to arrive if you want to explore the western side, which is very rugged, relatively unexplored and underpopulated side of the state. So the beauty of the state lies in the fact that it's like a mini New Zealand. If anyone has seen pictures of New Zealand or been there, it's got that rugged, hilly terrain. In Australia, our mountains are not big enough to be called mountains, but we like to call our hills mountains. So there are a lot of mountains in Tasmania, and a lot of natural beauty. So that has led to a significant movement amongst the local population. They're extremely green conscious. And in the 1980s, they had a huge agitation to stop one of the dams from being built. They also had agitations to stop the harvesting of old growth native timbers. Sometimes they didn't succeed, but at least it shows that the people are very sensitive to their own natural environment.
You mentioned the ruggedness of the west coast of Tasmania, and when you look at Australia, it seems like the major cities are all on the east and in the south. Brisbane and Sydney and Canberra and Melbourne. Yeah. You got Perth over here, but is that the terrain is equally rugged in the west of Australia, the mainland?
Not so much, because the mainland of Australia is largely flat, and if you were to drive, and I don't recommend driving from Melbourne to Perth, but some people have done that. It takes several days, and there's absolutely nothing. If you looked at the area above the Great Australian Bight and look to the west of that long stretch is the Nullarbor Plain, which refers to the Null Arbor, which is no trees. That's the original interpretation of that. And there are shrubs. I've done a train journey all the way from Sydney to Perth when we first arrived in Australia in 1980. And I've also flown over what's called the Air Highway. And the pilot was good enough to point it out, because he said, those on the left side of the plane, look down now and you'll see this long, skinny road. And I'll call you in about an hour. And you keep looking. So an hour later, we were still flying along this
wow.
long straight road, and that's when we turned off and landed at Perth. So the point there is, people say if you were to point your car straight and go to sleep, you could sleep for many hours and still be quite safe.
Oh, jeez. Wow.
Again, I don't advise you to do this at home or when you're on that road.
I think one of the interesting things of Tasmania in the history, and you mentioned Van Diemen's Land, is the history of the British sending prisoners there and using them as labor in some atrocious conditions. I guess is there any of that still in Hobart that you can see as a tourist? And
absolutely, yeah. So there is a penal colony there called Port Arthur. So that was a separate area, hence it had its own name of Port Arthur. And it is by the sea, so the old wooden ships were able to directly land there. And it has the ruins of the old buildings. So they're quite interesting in themselves. There is a museum, as you can imagine. However, it has a very sad recent history. Namely, in 1996, Australia saw its worst tragedy where a crazy young man with guns started shooting people at random. And I've forgotten the number of people he killed, but there were like 20 or 30 people, innocent people who had simply cornered and shot even when they were trying to hide. So that happened in a cafe, like a tourist cafe, which has since been completely removed because they didn't want any trace of it left. So I don't know if there are any markers there today because I think Australia wanted to forget it, or I don't remember seeing them. And almost overnight, Australia changed its gun laws. And since 1996, there has never been a mass shooting in Australia, which is defined as 4 or more people shot. And that's our definition of a mass shooting. And the closest Australia got to was 3 people shot at a university by a student. We haven't reached that, and hopefully we'll never have one again.
Yeah, that's so. Hobart, obviously, it's in the south. There is that the farthest south that you've ever traveled, or have you gone beyond that?
I didn't go much beyond Hobart. Now, I wish I lived there because one of my interests is to photograph the southern aurora. And although we can see it from Victoria, I've not had the patience to sit in a car alone for several hours because the aurora as seen from Australia is rather weak, and often you only see it at the back of the camera. So a digital camera can see it, especially if you give it a long exposure and then you process it and you get some amazing pictures. But as you can imagine, the further south you can go, it is much easier to see. So I'm part of a couple of groups where they publish maps of how far can the aurora be seen every time there's a lot of sunspot activity, especially one of those big flares. That is what sets it off. It's known as a CME, something event. Don't ask me for what that stands for, but it's like a huge explosion, and that sends these solar wind particles at a very high speed. And 2 or 3 days later, the aurora is visible at both ends of the Earth. So the northern aurora is also visible, the aurora borealis, whereas what we have is called the aurora australis.
So I was going to ask, you called it the southern aurora, but that's aurora Australis.
Yeah.
We have northern and borealis. Okay, that's something. This is a stupid question maybe, but here where I live, we have a large Polish community, and I'm looking at the map, and I see to the east of Melbourne is Mount Kosciuszko from the famous Polish. He fought with the U.S. in the Revolutionary War, of course, Lithuania and Poland and all that. Is there a Polish population there, or what's the story there?
Not specifically. Australia has not spawned huge communities of any specific nationality, with perhaps the sole exception of Germans. If you go just outside Adelaide, in the Adelaide Hills, they have 2 or 3 places that have German names, and they obviously celebrate that tradition. So in these places, you'll have German pastries, and because there are lots of wineries in the Adelaide Hills and in the general area, you'll get wines with German names.
I read about a historic brewery in Hobart. Did you get a chance to go to the Cascade Brewery when you were down there?
I didn't go inside. It's quite a prominent building, so everyone points it out.
Yeah.
But no, I didn't actually go inside that. But in that general area is a very interesting museum called MONA, which is the Museum of Old and New Art. So it's got both modern art and some of the older Australian paintings. So that's definitely worth a visit, as is an open air, I wouldn't call it a festival, but like an open air market called the Salamanca Market, which is a small street in Hobart where there are old stone buildings, and a lot of shops are allowed to open up, I think, on a Sunday, perhaps. Not every day because it's a regular street, but I think on a weekend they set up these stalls and people make and sell their handmade items in particular. So whether it's produce, honey, and jewelry and so on. So it's a very popular tourist attraction.
I have to ask, I'm just noticing, what's your background there? Is that home or?
No, that's Hobart. That's the city seen from the local vantage point, which is Mount Victoria.
Oh, okay.
So it's a nice little windy drive, and from the top you can see in 2 or 3 directions. In one direction, the hill is higher than what you can see, but in at least 3 directions, you can see quite a distance.
You've traveled extensively, and why don't you just share with some of our viewers some of the interesting places, what you might recommend to, if you get a chance to travel someday, what might be your favorite places that you've traveled?
My favorite place is New Zealand, and I'm a citizen of New Zealand as well, because I was born in India, but I emigrated to New Zealand first. So New Zealand offers 2 extremes of scenery. The North Island has volcanic scenery, so I haven't been to Yellowstone, but I'm told that there are aspects of Yellowstone that you would see around Rotorua, which has a lot of volcanic activity, to the point that you have to block your nose because the sulfur fumes are there all the time. So you get the smell of sulfur. There is steam coming out of the ground. Some houses used to have their private hot pool, but because that activity is going down, a lot of these private pools had to be sealed so that there was enough pressure left at the tourist attraction for a little geyser that comes up a couple of times a day. So maybe it's not as fantastic as Old Faithful, which you have in America, but it's a small version of that. And I think they have to load it with some detergent to make it look more interesting, but that's all part of the fun. So yeah, there are some interesting, colorful mud pools because volcanic mud that keeps bubbling out brings up all these multicolored minerals out of the ground. Then when you go further north, you have some natural coastal beauty. However, in the South Island, we get perhaps what you would call a small version of the Canadian Rockies. So there are mountains there with snow on them, skiing. The main advantage of traveling in New Zealand is that being such a small country, you can cover large distances. And by that I mean distances between two interesting scenic attractions. So you can cover a lot of these attractions often within the same day. So we did a 3-week road trip from the very top of New Zealand to the very bottom. And 3 weeks was a little too quick, but that's all the time we had. And because we used to live in New Zealand until 1980, we only covered the attractions that we had not seen. So perhaps if it's your first visit, you may want at least 4 weeks to do a similar journey.
You know, anyone, I'm sure you've seen The Lord of the Rings, and that scenery there, I guess they say that could only have been filmed in New Zealand. It's just incredible.
Yeah, and we've been to the actual location, which is called Hobbiton. It's a little farming area near a place called Matamata, where my wife used to live at one point. So they've preserved, they purchased the land from the farmer that had initially allowed these sets to be created. So the sets have been maintained, and so it's a very interesting detour. If you're going to Rotorua from Auckland, then a side trip to Hobbiton is quite easy. It takes like 2 or 3 hours to cover that area.
That's certainly on the bucket list, as is Tasmania. And, you know, we've got to get back to that. With all your travels, we'll have to get you on future episodes of Fun with Maps now. But I know I appreciate this, and an insider's look, you know, someone who's been in Hobart and been in Tasmania and so close, and to give us some of this information. We really appreciate it. And so we'll definitely have you back. I won't say good night. I mean, it's nighttime for me, but it's good morning for you the next day, which is so wild. So I will just say thank you very much. It's good to see you again, even on Zoom, and we'll be talking to you very soon.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Great to connect, and I look forward to it.